have you ever had a gut feeling that something just wasn't right? A moment when everything inside you screamed, warning, danger ahead? Well, that's exactly what happened to Emily, a waitress at a small upscale diner. But little did she know, her simple intuition was about to alter the course of not just one, but 2 lives forever. It was just another quiet evening at the diner when Jonathan, a well-known billionaire, walked in. He wasn't flashy. In fact, he looked like anyone else. He wasn't here for attention, he just wanted a quiet meal. But Emily, with her sharp eyes and intuition, couldn't help but notice something off about his companion, Carl. Carl wasn't just any friend. There was something in the way he spoke to Jonathan, too casual, too familiar. His eyes darted around the room like someone who didn't belong. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was something sinister behind Carl's smile. So, against the quiet hum of clinking plates and soft conversations, Emily did what most people would never dare to do. She walked up to Jonathan's table, took a deep breath, and warned him about his friend. "Mr. Jonathan, I don't mean to intrude, but I think you should be careful with your friend," Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady. Jonathan looked up, surprised, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I've been watching him," Emily replied, her voice low but firm. "He doesn't seem like someone you can trust." For a moment, the air between them hung thick with tension. Jonathan stared at her, his brows furrowed. Was he insulted? Was he offended? Or was he just trying to decide whether to dismiss her completely? "Why would you say that?" Jonathan asked, his voice cold but calm. Emily hesitated, but then decided to press on. "I don't know. There's just something in the way he speaks to you, like he's using you for something." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and for a brief second, Jonathan's gaze flickered to Carl, who was sitting across from him, completely unaware of the conversation. Jonathan didn't say another word. He simply nodded, a faint smirk forming on his lips. "Thanks for the advice, but I'm fine." And with that, Emily walked away. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a bold, dangerous move. Little did she know, the next day, her life would change forever. Emily was no stranger to the routine. Every evening, the small diner on the corner of 5th Street buzzed with familiar faces, locals who found comfort in the steady rhythm of coffee refills, the clink of silverware, and the low hum of quiet conversations. Sonny's Diner had been a staple of this town for years, and Emily had been working there for almost as long. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and that was enough. At 29, Emily had learned that sometimes, just making it through the day with a smile on her face was its own kind of victory. She was the kind of waitress who always remembered everyone's order, who could predict when someone needed more cream for their coffee or a refill on their water before they had to ask. Her regulars adored her, Mr. Thompson, who always came in for his slice of apple pie, Sally, the high school teacher who loved the chicken noodle soup, and even Earl, the grumpy old man who grumbled about everything, yet never failed to tip her well. Emily had a way of making people feel seen, and that made her good at her job. But despite the easy rhythm, tonight felt different. It was a Wednesday, a quiet evening, but something in the air had shifted. It was as if the diner was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The door jingled, and in walked Jonathan, a name most people in town knew, even if they didn't see him much. Jonathan Hartman, the billionaire behind a multi-million-dollar tech company. But unlike the other wealthy people who paraded their fortune like it was a trophy, Jonathan was different. He wasn't flashy. He didn't drive a showy car. He didn't surround himself with expensive things that screamed, "Look at me." When he walked in, he looked like any other man just out for a meal. The usual, casual hoodie and jeans. His face was strong, but not ostentatious. His eyes were sharp, but tired, as though he carried the weight of something heavier than money on his shoulders. Emily noticed him right away, not just because of his name, but because there was something magnetic about the way he carried himself. People like him, who had it all, always had a certain presence, like they were standing just slightly above everyone else without even trying. She greeted him with her usual warmth, but she knew that Jonathan didn't come for the fame or the recognition. He came because he wanted peace, something rare in his life. He was a man who seemed to find comfort in the simplest things: good food, a quiet booth, and no expectations. "Good evening, Mr. Hartman. What can I get for you tonight?" Emily asked, giving him her best professional smile. Jonathan nodded. "Just a coffee, black, and maybe a slice of your apple pie." "Sounds perfect." The order was simple, and for a moment, Emily thought that maybe this night would be just like any other. But then she noticed Carl, the man sitting across from Jonathan. Carl wasn't someone who fit into the quiet, understated scene of the diner. He was loud, animated, and seemed to command attention without even trying. Carl was older than Jonathan, perhaps in his mid-40s, with a scruffy beard and an air of someone who was used to getting what he wanted. His suit was impeccable, though he wore it like he didn't care about the expense. His eyes darted around the room with a nervous energy, scanning every face and every corner, as though he were on high alert. His voice was low, but it carried across the room, and Emily couldn't help but overhear parts of their conversation. "We could be making more moves," Carl was saying, leaning in close to Jonathan, speaking in a tone that was far too familiar. "The market is shifting, you know, and with the right push, we could dominate, especially if you play your cards right." Jonathan nodded slowly, his face unreadable. But Emily's instincts told her that something about Carl wasn't right. There was a hunger in his eyes, something predatory. And it wasn't just his words, it was the way he spoke to Jonathan, too casual, too familiar, as though they were far closer than they really were. Emily had seen people like Carl before, those who didn't just want to succeed, they wanted to use others to get ahead. She tried to shake the feeling. Maybe it was nothing. But something told her she couldn't ignore it. As she walked to the back to prepare Jonathan's coffee and pie, she watched them more closely. Jonathan seemed to be listening, but his expression was guarded, like he was weighing Carl's words carefully. He wasn't as eager as Carl was, and Emily couldn't help but wonder if Jonathan knew something she didn't. But Carl was persistent, pressing Jonathan harder with each passing moment. "That's the problem, Jonathan," Carl continued, his voice dropping lower. "You're playing it safe. You've got the power to change the game, to lead, and yet you're holding back. Don't you want to be remembered as more than just another tech mogul?" Emily's heart skipped a beat. That was when she realized Carl wasn't just trying to influence Jonathan's business decisions. He was trying to manipulate him. He was playing a dangerous game, and Jonathan, despite his billions, might be too blind to see it. But Emily wasn't blind. She had learned how to read people over the years, and right now, everything in her screamed that Carl was trouble. She set down the coffee pot, wiped her hands on her apron, and took a deep breath. She didn't have to say anything. She could walk away and mind her own business, as most people would do. But that wasn't who Emily was. She had never been the kind of person to let something wrong slide by. And right now, there was something very wrong happening at that table. As she walked back to their booth, her heart pounded in her chest. She was about to do something bold. Something risky. "Mr. Hartman," Emily said, standing tall and locking eyes with Jonathan. "I don't mean to intrude, but I think you should be careful with your friend." Jonathan looked up at her, surprised. Carl raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a half-smirk. "What do you mean?" Jonathan asked, his voice cool but intrigued. Emily swallowed, trying to steady her breath. "I've been watching him. He doesn't seem like someone you can trust." For a moment, she feared she had overstepped, that she had gone too far. But Jonathan didn't immediately dismiss her. He looked at Carl, then back at Emily, considering her words. "Why would you say that?" Jonathan asked, his tone guarded but thoughtful. Emily hesitated, but then spoke with conviction. "There's just something in the way he speaks to you. Like he's using you for something." Carl shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Jonathan remained silent, staring at Emily with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. And just like that, Emily had made her first move in a game she had no idea she was playing. Emily's hand trembled slightly as she poured Jonathan's coffee into the delicate porcelain cup. The steady pour was a familiar task, one she'd done countless times. But tonight, her mind was elsewhere, focused on the conversation unfolding at the booth. Her eyes flicked to Carl once more, his hands animated, his words sharp as he leaned in closer to Jonathan. Something about his posture was off, too eager, too insistent. Carl's voice had dropped even lower now, but Emily could still make out fragments of their conversation. "You're leaving too much on the table, Jonathan," Carl was saying, his voice dripping with a mix of urgency and persuasion. "You've got the capital, the influence. Why not push a little harder? Don't you want to be remembered as the one who changed the world?" Jonathan's face, always composed, now showed the slightest hint of discomfort. His lips tightened ever so slightly, but he didn't interrupt Carl. Emily watched as Jonathan's gaze drifted to the window, as if searching for something beyond the diner's confines, something perhaps only he could see. But Carl wasn't finished. He leaned in even closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "I've got connections. Big ones. You just need to trust me, Jonathan. We could be unstoppable. But we need to act now." Jonathan's eyes flickered briefly in Emily's direction. She caught the briefest moment of hesitation, something fleeting but real. For a moment, he seemed to be weighing his options, his friend's words, the promise of something more, something bigger, and Emily's warning voice that still echoed in the back of her mind. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but her instincts had kicked in the moment Carl had entered the diner. Something about him just didn't sit right. It wasn't the way he looked. He had the appearance of someone who was used to wealth and power, sure, but it was the way he spoke, the way he tried to charm, to manipulate. Emily had met her fair share of shady characters in her years at Sonny's, and Carl was a textbook example. There was something calculating in his demeanor, something predatory in his eyes. He wasn't just having a conversation with Jonathan, he was working an angle, and that made Emily uneasy. She couldn't put her finger on it, but every fiber in her being told her that Carl's intentions were far from innocent. A bead of sweat formed at the back of her neck, and she wiped it away quickly. She set the coffee down on the table with a soft clink, but her mind was still racing. The words she had been rehearsing in her head felt heavy now, too heavy to ignore. Emily knew that, in a place like this, people came and went all the time. Some were just passing through, and others, like Jonathan, became familiar faces, quietly observing their surroundings without ever really participating. But Carl, he wasn't just another regular. He was a presence that disturbed the balance of this place. She turned to walk back toward the counter, but her feet felt like they were moving in slow motion. Every step felt deliberate, as though she was heading toward a precipice, and the decision she was about to make would determine whether she would stay in her comfortable, predictable world or step into something much larger, much more dangerous. Her heart thudded loudly in her chest, but she couldn't stop now. Her instincts told her that this wasn't just a passing moment. She had to say something. She had to do something. Gathering her courage, Emily took a deep breath and walked back to the booth. She didn't know how Jonathan would react. He could brush her off. He could get angry. But if something went wrong, if Carl's manipulation continued unchecked, she couldn't live with herself for staying silent. "Mr. Hartman," Emily said, her voice steady but not without a hint of nervousness. Jonathan looked up, surprised at her interruption. Carl didn't seem fazed. His eyes narrowed slightly, almost as though he were daring her to speak. "I don't mean to intrude," Emily continued, her words measured but firm, "but I think you should be careful with your friend." Jonathan's brow furrowed slightly. He glanced at Carl, then back at Emily, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" he asked, the coolness in his voice betraying the curiosity beneath. Emily took a small step forward, careful to keep her voice even. "I've been watching him," she said, her tone dropping lower as she tried to convey the seriousness of her warning. "He doesn't seem like someone you can trust." The room seemed to quiet as Emily spoke, the clattering of dishes and murmurs of other customers fading into the background. The weight of her words hung in the air like a thick fog. Jonathan didn't say anything at first. His eyes studied her, a faint flicker of something unreadable passing through them. Carl shifted in his seat, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "What's this?" "You've been spying on us, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice oozing with sarcasm. Emily stood her ground, unshaken by Carl's taunt. "I'm not spying," she said, her voice firm now. "I'm just trying to tell you that he's not who he appears to be. People like him, people who don't have anything to lose, can be dangerous. And I don't want you to get hurt because you didn't listen." Carl's expression hardened, the playful smirk quickly replaced by a cold, calculating gaze. Jonathan, however, remained silent, his eyes moving from Carl to Emily, then back again. He was listening, and for the first time that evening, Emily felt like her words were getting through to him. For a long moment, Jonathan didn't speak. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Emily could feel the tension rise, the atmosphere thickening as the seconds ticked by. Carl broke the silence first, his voice low and dangerous. "You're out of line, miss," he said, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know what you're talking about." Emily didn't flinch. She knew she had crossed a line, but she didn't care. She had done what she felt was right, and now it was up to Jonathan to decide what to do with the information. "Maybe I don't know everything," Emily said, her voice steady, "but I know enough to know that not everyone who smiles at you is your friend." Jonathan's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he finally spoke. "Thanks for the advice," he said, his tone still cool, but there was something else there, something that suggested that he wasn't completely dismissing her warning. "I'll keep that in mind." And with that, Emily turned and walked away, her heart still pounding in her chest, her nerves raw. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if she had made a difference, or if Jonathan would ignore her completely. But one thing was certain, she had warned him. And now, it was out of her hands. The next morning, Emily woke to the usual hum of her apartment complex, distant voices, the faint rumble of a passing car, and the clinking sound of a neighbor's alarm clock. It was a quiet morning, a slow start to what promised to be another uneventful day. She brewed her coffee, the scent filling the small kitchen as she stared out the window, her mind drifting back to last night's conversation. Had she done the right thing? The memory of Jonathan's cool reaction still lingered, and Carl's mocking smile was etched in her mind. But even now, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Jonathan hadn't dismissed her outright. He hadn't brushed her off like most people would. He had listened. Maybe, just maybe, Emily had made a difference. But she was also fully aware of how easily her warning could have been forgotten, lost amidst the chaos of Jonathan's billion-dollar world. As she stepped out of the building and into the parking lot, Emily noticed something strange. A sleek, polished black SUV was parked directly in front of her car. It was out of place, with its shiny exterior gleaming in the morning sun, standing out against the otherwise ordinary vehicles parked around it. For a moment, she wondered if it was just a random car, but something about it felt too deliberate. Her thoughts immediately went to Jonathan. Could this be some sort of mistake? Maybe the car had been parked here by someone else, a delivery driver or someone else who didn't know better. But as she got closer, she saw that the car was parked in front of her usual spot. A small note was tucked under the windshield wiper. Emily's stomach tightened. She had no idea what this could mean, but the unease she felt deepened. With a hesitant hand, she reached for the note. Unfolding it carefully, she read, "For Emily. Please meet me at the diner. Jonathan Hartman." Her breath caught in her throat. There was no mistake. This was real. For a moment, her world seemed to tilt. She had barely slept, barely thought about anything other than the diner, the faces she served, and the mundane routine of her life. She had never expected a note like this, certainly not from a billionaire she had only spoken to once. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Emily moved through the motions, driving to work with the same autopilot routine she always followed. But this time, the normal sounds and sights of the day felt distant, as though she were living in a world that wasn't quite her own. Her mind kept returning to the note. To Jonathan. When she arrived at Sonny's diner, the usual peaceful atmosphere felt off-kilter. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, but instead of the warm greeting from her regular customers, the air felt thick, heavy. The place was quieter than usual, and every pair of eyes seemed to glance her way as she walked toward the back, wondering what had brought her here so early. And there he was. Jonathan Hartman sat at the same booth where he had sat last night. He was dressed in a casual jacket and jeans, but there was no mistaking the presence he carried with him. The billionaire aura was undeniable, and yet, there was something almost approachable about him now. The confident, commanding businessman from the previous evening had been replaced by a more human version of himself. He looked up as she approached, his eyes warm but serious. "Emily," he said, his voice steady but with a tinge of something more, something personal. "Thank you for coming." "Mr. Hartman," she replied, her voice betraying the nervousness she hadn't fully realized she felt until now. I didn't expect you to want to meet so soon." Jonathan gave a small smile, though his expression remained intense. "I don't usually do this. You have no idea how much your warning last night meant to me." Emily felt her stomach flip. "I'm just a waitress." "I didn't." He cut her off gently. "You saw something I didn't. You gave me a perspective I couldn't have gotten from anyone else." Emily's mind raced. She wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but the weight of it hung in the air. "I didn't mean to intrude. She trailed off, unsure of how to explain her decision to warn him. "I just thought maybe I could help." Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "You helped more than you know. Last night, Carl was trying to get me involved in something dangerous. I didn't see it at first, but the way you spoke to me, it made me stop and think. And after everything settled down, I took a closer look at Carl. He's been using me. Trying to manipulate me into funding some very questionable projects." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had known something was off about Carl, But hearing Jonathan confirm her suspicions was something else entirely. Jonathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't want to get into the details, but Carl isn't who I thought he was. And after our conversation, I realized I need to be more careful. With people. With my decisions. I've made a lot of mistakes lately, but you made me realize I can't keep making the same ones. Emily was silent for a moment, trying to process everything. The man she had warned, the man who had been dismissive and skeptical just hours ago, was now thanking her. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected anything. Jonathan continued, his voice softer now. I don't know how to repay you for what you did. But I do know this, I wouldn't be sitting here if it weren't for you. You opened my eyes, Emily. And that's why I'm here today. Mr. Hartman, Emily started, but she was interrupted by a sudden knock on the door. A tall man in a suit stepped inside, holding a briefcase. He looked around the diner, eyes landing on Jonathan, before he quickly approached. Mr. Hartman, the man said, his voice low, his face impassive. Your car is ready. Emily turned back to Jonathan, her head spinning. Car? Ready for what? Jonathan smiled, but there was something almost conspiratorial about it. I'm offering you something, Emily. Something bigger than this diner. Bigger than anything you've probably imagined. He paused, letting the words sink in. I want you to work with me. I need someone who can think outside of the box. Someone who can spot what others miss. I need you. Emily's breath caught. Wait. What do you mean? Her mind couldn't keep up with the shock of it all. Jonathan stood up, motioning for her to join him. I'm offering you a position. To work with me, not just as a waitress, but as someone who has insight, who knows how to see through the noise. There's an opportunity here for you, Emily. The shock of it all hit Emily all at once. She was just a waitress, she had never expected her life to change like this. But here it was, laid out in front of her, an opportunity to step into a world she had only ever imagined from the outside. And it was all because of one warning. Emily sat there, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. Jonathan Hartman, a man whose life was a million miles away from her own, was sitting across from her, offering her a life-changing opportunity. Just hours ago, she had been nothing more than a waitress in a small diner, living her quiet, unremarkable life. Now, Jonathan, a billionaire, was offering her a chance to step into a world she had never dared to dream about. It was all too much to grasp, too overwhelming to take in all at once. So, what exactly do you mean by work with you? Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her nerves palpable. Jonathan leaned back in his seat, his expression serious but kind. I mean that I want you to be part of something bigger than this diner. You've proven to me that you can see through the noise. You've got instincts that others would miss. I need someone like you on my team, someone who's willing to question things, to look deeper. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Emily stared at him, her heart racing. She had always believed that people like Jonathan, people with billions of dollars, operated in a world completely separate from hers. But here he was, speaking to her like she was an equal, like her opinion mattered. It felt surreal. Why me? She asked, struggling to find her voice. Why would you want someone like me? I'm just a waitress. I don't have any experience in, well, anything that you do. Jonathan's smile was soft, almost reassuring. It's precisely because you are a waitress. You've seen the world from a different perspective. You're not blinded by money or power. You can see people for who they truly are, and that's rare. You have something that money can't buy." Emily's mind spun. The weight of the offer, the gravity of what he was saying, felt like a dream. She had always been taught that her place in life was set, that people like her, people who served others, didn't get opportunities like this. And yet, here she was, being asked to step into a life that seemed impossible. "You're not just offering me a job, are you?" she asked cautiously, her voice trembling slightly. "No," Jonathan replied, his eyes steady. "I'm offering you a partnership. An opportunity to be part of something that's going to change everything. I'm building something, Emily, something that will make a difference. And I need people who aren't afraid to take risks, who aren't afraid to stand up and speak the truth. I need you to help me make sure I'm not being deceived. Help me see what others can't." Emily felt a chill run through her. This wasn't just about a job offer. This was about something bigger, something that had the potential to shake her world and his. The thought of leaving her life as a waitress behind was terrifying, but the idea of stepping into Jonathan's world, of helping him with something important, was equally exhilarating. "Where do I even start?" Emily asked, still trying to wrap her head around it all. She was almost afraid to accept, to believe it was real. She had never considered herself someone who could have a major impact. She had always kept to herself, never seeking attention. But now, Jonathan was asking her to take on a role that was more than she had ever imagined. Jonathan stood up and motioned for Emily to follow him. As they walked toward the door of the diner, Emily's thoughts raced. She had always kept herself small, hidden in the background, quietly serving others. This was different. This was an invitation to step into the light. The door swung open, and there, parked just outside, was a sleek, black luxury car. It wasn't the type of car that screamed wealth, it wasn't ostentatious or flashy. But it was unmistakable. A symbol of success, power, and, now, for Emily, an entirely new future. "Where are we going?" Emily asked, her voice still a bit unsteady. Jonathan smiled again, the same warm smile that had made her feel at ease from the first time she'd served him. "We're going to see the team. You'll meet some of the people I've been working with. And from there, you'll decide if you're ready to join me." The car door opened, and Jonathan gestured for her to get in. Emily hesitated for a moment, her mind still reeling. But then she did what she had never done before, she stepped forward, into the unknown. As they drove through the city, Emily watched the world pass by. She felt like she was in a dream, like she was watching someone else's life unfold. The people outside, the buildings, the cars, they all seemed so distant now, as if she were no longer a part of her old world. The car pulled up to a large, modern building, sleek glass and steel that towered above the street. Jonathan turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "This is it," he said simply. They stepped out of the car, and as they walked into the building, Emily felt the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just about her stepping into a new job. This was about becoming part of something transformative. Inside, the office was buzzing with activity. People moved quickly, speaking in hushed tones, typing away at computers, and discussing business with a sense of urgency. But in the midst of all the noise, Emily felt a strange calm wash over her. This wasn't the chaos she had imagined. This was the place where decisions were made, where people's lives were shaped. Jonathan led her to a large conference room, where a group of professionals were gathered around a table. They all looked up as he entered, nodding politely. Some seemed surprised to see Emily with him, but Jonathan didn't give any explanations. He simply motioned for her to sit. "This is Emily," Jonathan said to the group. "She's going to help us. I want you all to welcome her." The room was silent for a moment, and then, slowly, The team began to nod in agreement. Emily wasn't sure what she had expected, maybe skepticism, maybe doubt. But instead, she was met with acceptance. They didn't see her as just a waitress. They saw her as an equal, someone who had the potential to contribute in ways they hadn't imagined. As she took her seat at the table, Emily realized something. This wasn't just a chance for her to change her life. It was a chance to change the lives of others. To be part of something that mattered. And in that moment, she understood, she wasn't just stepping into Jonathan's world. She was stepping into her own. The door to the conference room closed behind them, and Emily felt the weight of the moment settle in her chest. She had made it. She had been given a chance to do something that would change everything. The real work had just begun. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Emily was now an official part of Jonathan Hartman's inner circle, a member of a team that was working on one of the most ambitious projects in the industry. Her days were filled with meetings, discussions, and brainstorming sessions. For the first time in her life, she felt like her voice was being heard, that her insights were valued. It was a far cry from the quiet hum of the diner, from serving coffee and clearing plates. Here, she was part of something important. But the transition wasn't without its challenges. Emily was constantly pushed out of her comfort zone, asked to contribute ideas on a level she had never thought possible. The high stakes, the fast pace, it was exhilarating but exhausting. She had moments of doubt, times when the weight of her responsibilities felt almost too heavy to bear. Could she really keep up? Could she really make a difference in a world so far removed from the one she had known? And then, one day, it happened. Emily had been working late, poring over documents and analyzing data for a new initiative Jonathan had tasked her with. As she sat in the conference room, the glow of the screen reflected off her tired face. A sudden knock on the door broke her concentration. Jonathan walked in, a serious look on his face. He didn't speak immediately, but his presence filled the room with a quiet intensity. "Emily," Jonathan said, his voice steady. "I've been watching you. Your work over the past few weeks, it's been impressive. You've exceeded every expectation I had." Her heart skipped a beat. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. Jonathan paused, and for the first time, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "I think it's time. You're ready." "Ready for what?" Emily asked, feeling a sense of anticipation building in her chest. "To take the next step. I've seen enough to know that you're more than just someone who helps me see the truth. You're someone who can lead. Someone who can drive change. And I want you to take the lead on the new project we've been working on." The words hit Emily like a wave. She had never expected to hear those words. "Led? Me?" It felt surreal, but in that moment, as she looked into Jonathan's eyes, she realized it wasn't a mistake. She had earned this. Jonathan continued, "This is your opportunity, Emily. I'm putting my trust in you. You've got what it takes to make this happen." Emily was speechless, her mind racing as the weight of the decision settled on her. She had always been the quiet observer, the person in the background. But now, she had the chance to lead, to shape the future of something bigger than herself. She looked at Jonathan, a sense of purpose settling in her chest. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "Let's do this." And with that, Emily stepped into the role that would define the rest of her life. The diner, the quiet life she had left behind, seemed like a distant memory. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a leader, a driving force behind a project that could change everything. It wasn't just a new chapter in her life, it was the beginning of a new story. As Emily settled into her new role, stepping into a world she had once only dreamed about, she realized something profound. Sometimes, the greatest opportunities in life come from the most unexpected places. A simple warning, a decision to speak up when it was easier to stay silent, had led her to a life she could never have imagined. Jonathan Hartman's trust in her, the opportunity to lead, and the chance to make a real difference in a world far beyond the diner, it wasn't just about career growth. It was about transformation. Emily had proven that her worth wasn't defined by the job she did, but by the courage she had to take action when it mattered most. Now, as Emily looked back, she realized that everything she had gone through, every moment of doubt, every step into the unknown, had shaped her into someone capable of facing challenges with confidence. She wasn't just a quiet waitress anymore. She was a leader, a force capable of changing the future. And so, Emily's story wasn't just about a waitress's unexpected rise. It was about the power of standing up for what's right, trusting your instincts, and never underestimating the potential inside you. If you've ever felt like your dreams were too far out of reach, or that your efforts to make a difference were too small, remember Emily's story. She was just like you, a person with doubts, with fears, with a job that seemed ordinary. But one act of bravery, one decision to stand up for what she believed in, led to an opportunity that changed her life forever. What about you? What can you do today to take that first step? Is there something you've been holding back on, a change you've been afraid to make? It's time to believe in yourself, to take action, and to make a difference. If you found inspiration in Emily's journey, let us know in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment where speaking up led to something incredible? Share your story with us. And if you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that remind us that anyone can create their own path, no matter where they start. The journey to greatness begins with one step. Don't wait for permission. Step into your future today.